what is happening at the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, Pakistan reeling under a new wave of terrorist violence, struggling to control TTP. All of it is related to Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan and our flawed Afghan policy, which believes that once Taliban return to Kabul, all our concerns will be addressed and all our interests will be served. What is happening right now is three bad policies, poorly thought and anticipated policies are converging at one point. The amount of violence that we have seen at the Pak-Afghan border in 3 years of the Taliban rule, we did not witness that in 2 decades of Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani's 2 consecutive regimes.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Today, I'm joined by a special guest who will speak with me on the ongoing issue of extremism and terrorism in Pakistan and what can Pakistan do to overcome that. I have with me a guest who has over a decade of experience. My guest today is Mr. Abdul Basit, who's right now working as a senior associate fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Abdul Basit, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you for inviting me, Usama.
All right. Basit, let's go ahead and dive deep into this conversation. And the very first question is that Pakistan in the very recent years continues to reel under pressure, when it comes to this threat of terrorism from the group of TTP. And we've really seen that there hasn't been a lot of headway between Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani government. And then at the same time, what we're really seeing right now is an ongoing spike on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. What do you really see? And much of it is really being initiated by Kabul. What do you really think is the strategy that is being employed by the Afghan Taliban as it sort of goes ahead in terms of increasing this violence, but then at the same time, it is doing very little to address Islamabad's concerns?
To simplify your question and to bring it back to where it belongs it all started with the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in August 2021. All the developments that you mentioned, what Kabul is doing or not doing, what is happening at the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, Pakistan reeling under a new wave of terrorist violence, struggling to control TTP, all of it is related to Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan and our flawed Afghan policy, which believes that once Taliban return to Kabul, all our concerns will be addressed and all our interests will be served. That oversimplistic and flawed thinking and the inability of our strategic leaders to anticipate what was in store for them if Taliban became total rulers of Kabul, that has resulted in where we are today. And what is happening right now is three bad policies. Poorly thought and anticipated policies are converging at one point. Our flawed border policy, where we thought fencing the border will save us from the blowback of Taliban's takeover, primarily cross-border terrorism from TTP. Our flawed Afghan policy, which totally and only banked on the Taliban, and our inconsistent counterterrorism policies. In bits and pieces, counterterrorism policies' kinetic domain has delivered result, but those results have been reversible because of the other two bad policies, the border policy and the Afghan policy. So this primarily answers 2 or 3 nodes of your question that why we are where we are today. Now, why Kabul hasn't really addressed our concerns or demands or our apprehensions? Just because they are an independent government. And because we fail to understand the link between TTP and the Afghan Taliban. Ideological bonds, the battlefield camaraderie, ethnic linkages, political linkages. We fail to grasp the depth of links and the relationship between the two groups. The argument on this side of border was in Islamabad. The argument was, and you talk to multiple officials, retired, serving bureaucrats, military officials, others, Afghan watchers, former ambassadors, with the notable exception of few, they all believe that once Taliban become a government, they'll be much more responsible and their own strategic calculus will change. So if they had to choose between TTP and the Pakistani state, given the amount of support Pakistan extended to the Taliban diplomatically, logistically, and otherwise over the years, as well as the leverages that Pakistan has against landlocked Afghanistan, economically, geographically, and in several other domains, they will choose Pakistan over TTP. But that thinking was flawed because it failed to appreciate the importance that Taliban attaches to ideology and their ideological framework, and how that ideological framework holds TTP closer to the Taliban's ranks than Pakistan. As a result of that, we stand in a no man's land today, where our counterterrorism, capabilities have a serious limitation due to cross-border sanctuaries of TTP. Our border policy is in tatters because they keep questioning the border fencing, not only verbally in the propaganda and information space, but also physically. The amount of violence that we have seen at the Pak-Afghan border in 3 years of the Taliban rule, we did not witness that in 2 decades of Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani's two consecutive regimes. And I think now we need to start from a scratch, first to grasp the enormity of the situation, before that acknowledging our flawed policies, our flawed strategic thinking, and then, devise a new strategy to deal with the landscape that has emerged in the last 3 years.
And so before I come to, what options are available to Islamabad, let me ask you, what does it really tell about Taliban where it has decided to give, where it decided to actually give precedent to TTP over relations with Islamabad? What does that really tell you about, the leadership in Kabul itself, or perhaps say in Kandahar?
That they are an ideological jihadist group. They believe in their ideology. They have never, hesitated to implement what they believe in. It tells us that the myth which was created that Taliban 2.0 are different from Taliban 1.0. There is no difference. Taliban 2.0 are continuation of Taliban 1.0. They still believe in the same worldview. They, in a way, honor their ideological commitments to various groups that really help them in winning against the US. TTP is one of them. TTP hosted them. TTP gave them refuge. TTP helped them in fighting against the US. They fought together on the battlefield. So they dined and bled together. So they are not going to abandon TTP just because Pakistan has a problem. Now we see TTP as a terrorist group. Taliban do not see them as terrorists. Taliban do see them as a challenge, but a challenge which they would rather like to, continue hosting instead of going against them. Because if Taliban do any crackdown against TTP, TTP's fighter will start moving towards IS state.
And so now,
so the Taliban, for that reason, continue to host TTP. They have taken some tactical measures of, relocating TTP from border areas, sometimes bringing in a code of conduct to implement, to make sure that, they follow what the framework Taliban have devised for them, and registering them so they exactly know who is in Afghanistan, what are their locations and what are they doing. But beyond that, Generally, they have given complete autonomy to TTP to do whatever it wants to do. So TTP under the Taliban's protection umbrella, notwithstanding some restrictions that the Taliban have imposed on them, sometimes on Pakistani pressure, notwithstanding that they have an operational autonomy and they have a conducive environment in Afghanistan to reconsolidate, grow in size, grow in strength, grow in sophistication in terms of their propaganda capabilities, operational capabilities, as well as in their strategic thinking. And we see the result of that as in the form of uptick of violence across the border in Pakistan.
Now, speaking of the options that might be available to Islamabad, what do you think those options could be? And out of those very options, what do you think might be the most pragmatic way forward for Islamabad?
Unfortunately, Pakistani options right now are from bad to worse. And that is due to our bad policies, the three bad policies, two bad policies, one inconsistent policy that I have mentioned. Now, before going to that, it is important for me to qualify what I'm saying. So there was a consensus after the Army public school attack in December 2014 in Peshawar that consensus was, a national action plan that emerged in the aftermath of that attack, and that consensus was enshrined in that document. And that document categorically maintained that there will be no negotiations with any terrorist group. But we saw that, there were talks with TTP, covert talks conducted with TTP soon after the Taliban took over, and some TTP elements were allowed to return to Pakistan. Now, I don't have a problem with talking to TTP. I don't have a problem of trying alternative options, because at the end of the day, all disputes are settled on negotiation table through talks, and conflicts and wars are politically terminated. I get that philosophy. I'm all for that. My problem is in the manner in which talks took place. One individual was empowered to go and talk, and he single-handedly destroyed that national consensus which was enshrined in the National Action Plan. And now we are dealing with the same situation. We are back to the pre-2014 times where TTP is strong, violence levels are very high, and we don't have, many options to deal with this situation. So rather than one individual going and talking to TTP through informal channels, a more appropriate way forward should have been the parliament discussing the pros and cons of talking to TTP, under which conditions talks will take place, and under which conditions talks will not take place. Once that consensus was built and all stakeholders were taken on board, only then those talks should have taken place, number one. Number two, Pakistan should have talked to Taliban in a state-to-state framework rather than talking to a non-state actor. By talking to a non-state actors, they really gave a lot of leverage to TTP. Inadvertently, the Pakistani state admitted that TTP is an important stakeholder, and TTP really leveraged that position, by in its propaganda and in the information space. Anyways, as a result of that, TTP bought a lot of time. They got space. They used that to resurrect, reestablish, and reassert itself. And now we are left with bad to worse option. So I think the first point, and it is going to be a long struggle, by the way, and there are no easy answers to this. That becomes quite obvious from my answer, the way I qualified why I'm saying what I'm saying. I think number one, we have to revisit our Afghan policy. We have to re-look into our Afghan policy, and most of the fundamental assumptions that we had to about the Afghan Taliban have proven to be wrong. Now, the dilemma here is, while we revise our Afghan policy, the international attention and resources have moved elsewhere. They have moved towards the great power competition, and there is really no appetite apart from, countering the ISKP's threat in Afghanistan, there is no real appetite to, counter terrorism, which is emanating from Afghanistan, at least at the regional level. So TTP's threat is not a Western or an international or a US concern. ISKP is. So there will be only very limited international cooperation assistance available. Now, our resources are very, very narrow. We don't have a political bandwidth. We have several other issues going on. So with narrow political bandwidth, restrained financial base, and very little interest of the international community in countering terrorism now emerging from Afghanistan, I think we will struggle. But nevertheless, we have to revise our Afghan policy. And when we say revise our Afghan policy, I totally disagree with, taking out anger and frustration on Afghan refugees. That's a recipe for a new disaster. Even those Afghans who do not sympathize with the Taliban will start sympathizing with them for taking a stand for the refugees and our bad policy. Our Afghan policy has to undergo a change with a dispassionate thinking, with a long-term approach, and again, the right forum for that will be the parliament, number one. Number two, we have to re-look into our border policy. We erected a fence. I agree with that. But the thinking there is also flawed. So how we improve our border patrolling, safeguarding mechanisms to make sure that cross-border militancy declines. If cross-border militancy declines, then the third node of this framework will be kinetic operations within our geographical borders, particularly in the ex-FATA region or the newly merged districts, to blunt the rise of TTP in the operational domains. Once that is achieved, and that will take a long time, as I said, the threat has resurrected. It is more lethal, more sophisticated, more tech-savvy, politically very astute. So it is going to be a long struggle. So we have to be patient. And I think one area where the state and the stakeholders need to sensitize public opinion is that there is not going to be an overnight change or any, achievement against terrorism. It is going to be a slow struggle, but then the question is whether we will be consistent or not. So whatever counterterrorism policies are adopted, it should be consistent. And once in the operational domain, you gain an advantage over these groups. And state always had enough resources. The timelines can change, but non-state actors can never impose themselves over states. So states always have an upper hand. It depends on how and under what conditions they try to use hard power in a smart manner to gain an advantage. Once you have that advantage, then the non-kinetic aspects of counterterrorism become important, where political processes should be started to, convert those gains into tangible outcomes. If your kinetic and non-kinetic options do not work in tandem, as we have seen, the kinetic advantages achieved between 2015 and 2019 were reversed because of bad political policies. For instance, reforms in the ex-FATA region. The promises made with the people of those regions, those promises should be fulfilled. People of FATA should be mainstream. They should be brought into the mainstream. And whatever development, promises were made to them, they remain unmet until today. So I think, and that is a different domain of governance, whether resources are available or not. There is politics involved in it as well. So I think once these elements come together, only then in a span of 4 to 5 years, provided we have consistency, we might see the tide reversing in our favor and against these non-state violent actors. First national action, national internal security policy that then Interior Minister Chaudhry Nisar came up with, it was superseded by the National Action Plan. The next national internal security policy that which Hassan Iqbal, he was the main brain behind it. It was never implemented by the PTI government. Then PTI government came up with its own national security policy. Nobody adopted that. And now, if I'm correct, a new national internal security policy is being written because the national internal security policy, which was written under Hassan Iqbal from 2019 until 2023, has expired. So these documents have been written. If you read those documents, they make all the right political noises. The larger question is whether we can implement even half of what is written in those documents or not. Even you set aside these policies, look at our Anti-Terrorism Act 1997. That law is a very comprehensive law. So it's not that we don't have enough laws or policies or strategies to counter terror. The problem is we have never implemented them. The problem is of consistency. The problem is where, individuals have behaved like institutions, and institutions, unfortunately, have behaved like individuals. We really have to correct that balance. So institutionalization of policies, continuity is very, very important, number one. Number two is in counterterrorism. And you look at what is written in these documents and the amount of coordination it requires between different military and non-military or civilian institutions, that is what holds the key. So inter and intra-institutional coordination, which is the job of NECTA. I think if that hurdle is crossed and that barrier in a way is tackled or removed, we will see better results in the operational domain. So I'm all for these policies. These policies are very good, but implementation has remained a problem, and consistency of those policies. Someone should at least ask a question: what's the use of writing these policies if they were never implemented? National Internal Security Policy and National Action Plan were not very different from each other. But why National Internal Security Policy was ignored and National Action Plan was prioritized? Why Hassan Iqbal's National Internal Security Policy was ignored by the PTI government, and National Security Policy that Mueed Yusuf, who was the main brain behind the National Security Policy, why nobody looked into that document? A lot of work, effort, time went into preparing those documents. So I think seriousness on part of our civilian government is very important. And also, one has to look into whether all the stakeholders across the board in Pakistan had a buy-in into these documents or not. Because I think at the end of the day, some of it also boils down to whether certain institutions are comfortable with those policies or not. So there are bureaucratic, turf battles involved. And as a result of that, the policy, suffers.
That's quite interesting that you've tried to actually, knock in some doors of wisdom, at least when it comes to, adoption and implementation of policies. Now, let me draw my attention to diplomacy and to, Pakistan-China cooperation. We've seen in recent months and also in recent years, the amount of attacks on Chinese nationals and investments have scaled up. They've been coming from different groups, but when we actually see it, attacks that have actually come from groups like TTP, on the other hand, we also see Chinese diplomats actually reaching out to Kabul and particularly the Afghan Taliban to discuss security-related issues as well. Have you come across any reports, particularly in light of the recent attacks that have taken place on Chinese nationals in Pakistan, to sort of force Taliban to do something about the problem from the TTP itself or the different factions associated with TTP?
So the bulk of terrorist attack in Pakistan against Chinese interests and nationals have come from Baloch separatists, with the exception of 3 to 4 attacks. Two of those attacks were on the Dasu hydropower project, engineers in KP, and one was at the Serena Hotel in Quetta, where Chinese ambassador of that time was present. TTP claimed that attack, but then backtracked, partially backtracked. The other two attacks, but no one claimed responsibility for that. Now, former TTP elements who are now freelance, so-called freelance militants, they have been involved in these attacks. But the bulk of attack, 90% of these attacks have come from BLA's Mujib Brigade, which is the suicide squad of BLA. So that's where the problem is. Mostly in Balochistan and Karachi, 2 or 3 attacks have taken place in KP as well. Now, I think TTP has distanced itself from these attacks. So some former TTP elements now, operating as freelance jihadists or militants are involved. So 3 main threat groups one can identify threatening Chinese interests in Pakistan. Number one, Baloch separatists. They have an entire alliance, BRAS, Baloch, Raji, Ajoi, Sangar, which involves 4 or 5 Baloch separatist groups, and they have a nexus with the Sindhi separatist groups, Sindhu Desh Revolutionary Army or SRA as well. You look at the document they produced when they made this alliance. It was primarily to undermine Chinese interests in Pakistan. So they are involved in most of the attacks. The other threat group which really poses a threat to China is the Islamic State of Khorasan, which is the so-called Islamic State's franchise in Afghanistan. ISK has been involved in attacking China. One of the hotels, Logan hotels in Kabul, which was frequented by Chinese nationals. They were involved in 1 or 2 attacks on Chinese in Balochistan as well. And in their propaganda, they continuously threaten China for multiple reasons. That's the main. And the third element is these freelance militants, ex-TTP groups. So one faction or some individuals within the group might be involved in attacking Chinese interests. Now, whether China has been talking to Kabul and Iran about these threats. So China constituted this 2 minilateral. One was with Iran, Pakistan, and China about counterterrorism. If I'm correct, a new meeting of Iran, Pakistan, and China is due in the coming weeks or next 2 months. A meeting will take place. We all know the unfortunate incident that has taken place in Iran. So Iran is going through a leadership transition. So I do not know what will be the new dates of that and whether that meeting will take place on time or not. But that's one framework that China has come up with to tackle with the separatist problem in Balochistan, and also the issue of cross-border terrorism that takes place in the border regions of Pakistan and Iran. We know what happened in earlier this year, with both countries carrying out tit-for-tat strikes in each other's territories against threat groups in border regions. The other, mini-lateral is between Pakistan, Kabul, and China. So I think these are the frameworks that China has created to talk about security issues, to settle some of the, entrenched issues such as border security, cross-border militancy, groups threatening Chinese interests, and beyond that, I think China has been talking to Kabul and Tehran both, because groups in those countries are threatening Chinese interests. And these countries, Iran, with the 25-year strategic agreement that it signed with China, and Kabul, which is very keen to, attract Chinese investment in Afghanistan, particularly in energy and mineral sectors. so China has some leverage over these countries. Whether it results in anything tangible or not remains to be seen. But I think these are the frameworks which are there, and this is how China is trying to deal with the problem diplomatically, as well as try to come up with some institutional mechanism where perhaps joint coordination could, help these countries remove their trust issues and better coordinate with each other on the issue of terrorism.
And speaking of the bilateral element, what areas do you see both China and Pakistan cooperate in when it comes to improving their security cooperation in terms of improving the security of the Chinese nationals present in Pakistan?
So if you if you look at the last attack that took place in KP, I think some high-ranking senior police officials were fired for neglecting their duties because as far as I know, the new SOP is to use bulletproof vehicles for the land movement of Chinese engineers and workers in Pakistan. The bus that was used was not bulletproof. So I think the SOPs perhaps were neglected. There was negligence on part of those responsible for the security. So I think re-looking into the poor implementation of the SOPs that have been devised to protect Chinese nationals and their assets and projects interests in Pakistan. And B, I think special equipment required to make sure that there is foolproof security in place, better training, coordination, cooperation. All of these elements go a long way in improving the security. But the larger problem is, or the elephant in the room is, deteriorating security situation in Pakistan. So while you can do, a lot to improve the security of Chinese nationals and their projects in Pakistan, bottom line is, as long as the overall security situation in Pakistan is volatile, there will always be a threat to anyone investing in Pakistan, anyone, any foreign national having a presence here, particularly Chinese. So I think you have to look into your overall security situation and specifically the security of Chinese. If the overall security doesn't improve, no matter what SOPs you come up with and no matter what capabilities you put in place, the threat will always be there.
And now, Abdul Basit, speaking of Iran itself, recently you did make a mention of the unfortunate helicopter crash, which resulted in the loss of the Iranian president and their foreign minister also. And both of them were actually leading the delegation that recently visited Islamabad, met the leadership in the capital here. Let me ask you, security cooperation was certainly one of the elements that was covered in the recent trip. What do you think should the focus really be for Islamabad once we have a new leadership take power or assume power in Tehran?
I think so. China has created a mechanism, right? A minilateral, a tripartite framework. The discussions in that framework should continue, and then bilaterally, both countries should try to address each other's concerns, legitimate concerns. Iran needs to revisit policies in the Sistan-Balochistan province. Pakistan has to revisit some of the policies it is pursuing, especially the militarized counterinsurgency framework that is in place right now in Balochistan. There should be a political strategy to tackle some of the problems. Balochistan's problem primarily is a political issue. There is no security solution to it. Security tools can help you create an atmosphere where you try to achieve a political solution. And so I think diplomacy, talking of border security management, livelihood question of the people living near these borders, the fencing of the border and how it has impacted the livelihoods of people living in the border areas, because a lot of trade, cross-border trade, is informal, or some people would use the word illegitimate. How do you formalize that without hurting the livelihood options of people living in border areas? Because you see, Balochistan is huge, and most of the far-flung areas are closer to Iran than they are to Quetta or Pakistan, mainland Pakistan for that matter. So they have a natural association with Iran. So you have to, formalize and facilitate rather than erecting a fence which disrupt the livelihood of these people. Because if you are not in a situation to offer livelihood or, create jobs for them, then facilitate rather than disrupt. Border fencing is important, but managing and facilitating the livelihood opportunities in the form of illegal trade for these people as well. So I think these are those questions which both sides will have to tackle. And then there is geopolitics involved. Uh, Pakistan's natural inclination has always been towards Saudi Arabia for historical and other reasons. And the relationship between Iran and Pakistan has always remained very mixed because, we all know that Kulbhushan Yadav was, operating from Iran and he was arrested there. And these Baloch separatist groups, they have sanctuaries in Iran. So we have those geopolitical issues. How do these two countries tackle the geopolitical domain, given the fact that now China is involved in Iran Pakistan equation, and China was instrumental in brokering the Saudi Iran deal. So if there is Iran Saudi rapprochement and China's involvement in Iran Pakistan equation, that leaves a lot of room for optimism. So I think things between the two countries can improve despite what happened in January, provided the different points that I mentioned, policy issues that I mentioned, they are judiciously and dispassionately tackled.
And Abdul Basit, before we wrap up the conversation, my last question has to do with both geopolitics and great power competition. We see both the United States and China be engaged in this new competition, and of course that has also resulted in shift of the great powers, and particularly the United States, away from the region of Afghanistan and Pakistan towards South China Sea and also towards Asia Pacific. Let me then ask you, what is it that you could really see as a possibility in terms of both Beijing and Washington coming to some kind of an overlap with Islamabad in terms of developing a consensus on how to deal with this issue of terrorism, especially the threat that is actually emanating from Afghanistan?
That's an important, interesting, but a difficult question to answer, Usama. Great power competition definitely has relegated terrorism and counterterrorism to a tier 3, tier 4 level priority for the international community. There is no space, no resources, no attention space right now in the West, particularly in the US, as far as terrorism is concerned. And whatever attention and resources are there, we all know that domestic terrorism has become a major issue in the US and in Europe. So the threat of terrorism emanating from these extreme right, far right groups takes priority over, religious militancy in far-flung areas like Afghanistan. ISKP is one group that really has threatened security in the West, and they are concerned about it. Apart from that, there is not much, appetite in the West right now as far as Afghanistan. For them, Afghanistan is more of a liability rather than a priority as of now. But we all know that threat is evolving in Afghanistan. Now, during the Cold War between US and Russia, terrorism was used as a proxy tool. We know how these Afghan Mujahideen groups were created and the way they were used to defeat former Soviet Russia, and then what happened and all. So with the great power competition now re-emerging between US, with resurgent Russia and the rise of China, will terrorism be used as a proxy tool once again or not? That is a question that remains to be answered. And some of the things that you are asking, we will know their answers once we see how terrorism evolves. But history, as you know, is not a linear process. The presence of these apocalyptic groups, I think, will inform these countries to form some kind of concentrate. Now, if you look at two ISKP attacks in this year, one in Iran, in Kerman, and the other in Moscow, for both attacks, there were prior warnings given or alerts given by the US to both countries. They picked up their signal intelligence or whatever, and they, in a way, tipped off these countries that there could be attacks. Those warnings or alerts were ignored because these were general in nature and not more specific, actionable intelligence was available. But it at least tells you that as far as transnational terrorism is concerned, despite great power competition, there is still space there for these countries to cooperate with each other. The parallel that I can draw with the Cold War is the way US and Russia cooperated with each other on nuclear issue of nuclear proliferation and missile race. Most of the agreements that we see today, they emerged as a result of cooperation between US and Russia during the height of Cold War, given the mutually assured destructive nature of nuclear weapons. Similarly, these groups, terrorist groups, everybody knows, even if you use them as proxies, after a certain point, they are on their own. They assume a life of their own and they pursue their own interests. And they are capable of undermining national securities of these countries. So these countries, while they compete with each other geopolitically and geoeconomically, I think they would not like to cede space to these groups, to exploit their differences and the gaps which are there in the great power competition for advancing their own ideological and strategic interests. So I am only hopeful, but a more substantive answer to this question will come as great power competition will evolve in the coming months and years.
On this note, Abdul Basit, thank you so much for being part of InferTalks today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Mr. Abdul Basit. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.